The sun was shining bright over the industrial part of town, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Inside the Arch motorcycle showroom, however, the lighting was perfect cool, electric and designed to show off machinery rather than people. This wasn't your typical motorcycle dealership with crowded racks and loud salesmen. It felt more like a high-end art gallery. Except the paintings on the walls were replaced by sleek, chrome masterpieces of engineering. The floors were polished concrete, so clean you could see your reflection in them, and the air smelled distinctly of rich, dark coffee mixed with just a hint of motor oil. It is a specific smell that people who love machines find incredibly comforting. A scent of hard work and creativity. Keanu Reeves was standing near the back of the large open room, completely absorbed in what he was doing. He wasn't wearing a disguise, but he also wasn't dressed like a movie star. There were no designer suits or entourages in sight. He was wearing a simple, gray t-shirt that looked like it had been washed 100 times, a pair of dark jeans and sturdy leather boots. To anyone walking in off the street, he looked like just another mechanic or maybe a friend of the owner who was hanging out to watch the bikes being built. His hair was slightly messy, and he stood with a relaxed posture, his shoulders dropped. Looking entirely at peace, he was focused on a prototype bike that was propped up on a display stand. It was a stunning machine, black and dangerous looking, with custom parts that gleamed under the spotlights. Keanu wasn't just looking at it. He was studying it. He ran his hand gently over the curve of the gas tank, his fingers tracing the metal as if he were reading Braille. You could tell immediately that this wasn't a publicity stunt. He wasn't posing for a camera that wasn't there. He genuinely loved these bikes. He was deep in conversation with one of the head builders, a man wearing blue cover-ups with grease stains on the sleeves. They weren't talking about Hollywood blockbusters or movie scripts. They were talking about suspension geometry. They were debating the angle of the handlebars and the torque output of the engine. Keanu would listen intently, nodding his head and then ask a question in a soft, respectful voice. He treated the mechanic not as an employee, but as an expert. It was clear that in this room, Keanu wasn't the boss. The engineering was the boss. The two of them laughed about something, a shared joke perhaps about an engine. They had struggled with years ago, and the sound was genuine and warm. The shop was quiet, but not empty. There were a few customers browsing the floor, looking at the price tags and admiring the craftsmanship that went into these American-made machines. Usually, when a celebrity as famous as Keanu Reeves walks into a public place, the energy shifts. People stare, phones come out, and whispers start. But here, the atmosphere was different. Maybe it was because he was standing in the shadows near the workbenches. Or maybe it was because he gave off such a strong, do not disturb vibe. People would walk past him, look at the bike he was touching, and keep walking without realizing that the guy in the gray t-shirt was the global superstar they had seen in movies. Just a few weeks ago, he moved from the prototype to a finished bike on the floor. He crouched down, his knees popping slightly, to get a better look at the exhaust system. He checked the welds with a critical eye, looking for any imperfections. Finding none, he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag. It was a small action, but it showed how much he cared about the details. He wasn't just putting his name on a logo. He was building a product that he would want to ride himself. A younger sales associate walked by with a tray of coffee cups for the staff. Keanu reached out, took one with a polite nod and a thank you, and leaned back against a high metal workbench. He took a sip, looking around the shop. You could see the tension leaving his face. This was his sanctuary. Away from the red carpets, the flashing lights, and the noise of the entertainment industry, this place was real. Here, things were made of metal and rubber. If something was wrong, you fixed it. It made sense. The sunlight streaming through the large glass garage doors was starting to shift, turning the concrete floor a golden color. The shop felt like a bubble of peace in a busy city. The sound of an air wrench hummed softly in the background workshop, mixed with the low murmur of a couple looking at a leather jacket in the merchandise corner. Everything was balanced. Keanu set his coffee down and went back to looking at the schematics on the table, pointing something out to the builder. He looked happy, just a guy in his element. Enjoying a quiet Tuesday afternoon at work, he had no idea that the peace was about to be broken. The calm, respectful atmosphere of the dealership was about to be tested by a stranger who didn't care about the quiet dignity of the room. For now, though, Keanu just stood there, frozen in a moment of concentration, the unsuspecting owner of a shop that was about to get very loud. The peaceful hum of the motorcycle shop, which had felt so steady and calming just moments before, was suddenly shattered. It wasn't a gradual change, like the sun slowly going down. It was instant, like a glass dropping on a hard floor. The heavy glass front door slid open with a swoosh, but the person who walked in didn't bring the fresh air from outside. Instead, they brought a wave of loud, chaotic energy that instantly made the room feel smaller and tighter. A man strode into the showroom like he was walking onto a stage he owned. He was dressed in a suit that looked incredibly expensive, the kind of fabric that doesn't wrinkle and shines a little under the lights. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, clicking loudly against the concrete floor with every step he took. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and he certainly wasn't there to admire the engineering. He was holding a phone to his ear, speaking loudly about millions of dollars and closing deals, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He didn't even glance at the beautiful motorcycles lining the walls. To him, they were just background noise. He ended his phone call abruptly, almost throwing his phone into his pocket, and marched straight toward the main counter. The young woman working at the front desk, who had been organizing some paperwork, looked up with a polite, professional smile. She opened her mouth to greet him, likely to ask how his day was or if he needed help finding anything. But she didn't get a single word out. The man in the suit didn't wait for a greeting. He didn't believe in waiting. He leaned over the counter, invading her personal space, and started snapping his fingers. The sound was sharp and annoying, cutting through the quiet air. "Excuse me," he barked, his voice dripping with impatience. "I need someone to help me. Now, I don't have all day to stand around." The young woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his aggression. She started to explain that a sales associate would be right with him, but he cut her off again. "I'm not interested in waiting," he said, looking around the room with a sneer, as if the mere fact that he had to be there was an insult to him. "I am a busy man. I came here to buy, not to watch you people shuffle papers." The atmosphere in the shop changed instantly. The mechanic who had been laughing with Keanu moments ago stopped working. The salespeople talking quietly in the corner went silent. Everyone felt that uncomfortable tension that happens when someone behaves badly in public and nobody knows quite how to react. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a weight on your chest. People exchanged worried glances, but nobody wanted to make it worse by stepping in. The man, seemingly pleased that he had silenced the room, turned his attention to the motorcycles. But he didn't look at them the way Keanu did. He didn't touch the metal gently or admire the craftsmanship. Instead, he walked around a sleek, black bike near the front, poking at it with his finger. He scowled at the price tag hanging from the handlebar. $50,000? He scoffed loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "For this? It's ridiculous. You people must think customers are stupid." He started to wander deeper into the showroom, getting closer to the service area where Keanu was still standing near the workbench. The stranger was walking fast, his arms swinging, looking for someone else to bully. He spotted a young technician in blue coveralls who was carefully arranging tools on a cart. The technician looked like he was barely 20 years old, focused entirely on doing his job correctly. The man in the suit marched right up to him. He didn't ask for help. He demanded it. "Hey, you!" the man shouted. The young technician froze, his eyes going wide. "Yes, sir?" he asked timidly. "How much is this bike?" The stranger asked, pointing at a prototype without even looking at it. When the technician started to explain that it was a custom build and pricing varied, the man exploded. "I don't want a lesson on your business," he yelled, his face turning red. "I want a price, and I want you to wipe that smirk off your face." The technician wasn't smirking, he was actually terrified, but the man didn't care about the truth. He only cared about power. He took a step closer, towering over the seated mechanic. using his height and his loud voice to intimidate him. "I've been to dealerships all over the world," the man ranted, his voice bouncing off the walls. "I have never seen such poor service. You're all lazy, too busy talking to each other instead of working." This was ironic considering that everyone in the shop had been working diligently until he walked in. He was creating a problem just so he could complain about it. Keanu was standing just a few feet away. He had his back partially turned, looking over a clipboard, but he wasn't reading it. He was listening. Every muscle in his body had tensed up. He could feel the anger rising, not just for himself, but for the people who worked there. These were his friends, his team, his partners. He saw the look of humiliation on the young technician's face. He saw the fear in the receptionist's eyes. It was painful to watch. The stranger wasn't done. He waved his hand dismissively at the technician. "Forget it. Go fetch me a bottle of water. And make sure it's cold. I'm thirsty standing here in this heat." It was a disgusting command, treating a skilled craftsman like a servant. The technician hesitated, unsure of what to do, which only made the man angrier. "Did you hear me? I said go." The man was loud, rude, and completely out of control. He was like a storm cloud raining on everyone's parade. He had no idea that he was being watched by the very person who owned the place. He just saw a guy in a t-shirt who looked like he worked on the floor, someone he could ignore or push around. He was so focused on his own importance, so blinded by his own ego, that he didn't notice the quiet man in the corner slowly turning around, fixing his eyes on him. The shop was no longer a sanctuary of peace. It was a battleground, and the first shot had just been fired. The customer in the expensive suit, still red in the face from his yelling match with the young technician, spun around on his heel. He was looking for someone else to order around, someone else who would listen to him. His eyes scanned the room, skipping over the gleaming motorcycles that everyone else came to admire, and landed instead on a figure standing near the back workbench. It was Keanu. From the stranger's perspective, Keanu looked like the easiest target in the room. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't holding a clipboard like a manager. He was just standing there in his gray t-shirt and jeans, holding a wrench, looking down at an engine part. To the arrogant customer, this was clearly a mechanic. To him, Keanu was just another worker, someone he felt completely entitled to command. He saw the casual clothes and the quiet demeanor and made a snap judgment. It was a terrible mistake, but he was too full of himself to realize it. He marched across the polished floor, his footsteps heavy and echoing. He didn't walk with the curiosity of a buyer. He walked with the authority of a dictator. As he got closer, he didn't offer a smile or a nod. He just stared, his eyes narrowing, planning out his next complaint. The air around the workbench seemed to get heavy. The other mechanics working nearby noticed the man heading straight for their boss. They stopped what they were doing, their eyes going wide. They saw the look on the customer's face and knew exactly what was coming. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. They wanted to warn him, to shout out, "That's the owner." But the shock held them back. Keanu, for his part, was still focused on the machine in front of him. He was in his own world, thinking about how the piston moved, completely oblivious to the storm heading his way. He hadn't heard the earlier commotion clearly, just the background noise of the shop. He didn't know that this man had just bullied a young kid and terrified the receptionist. He just sensed a presence approaching his personal space. The customer stopped right in front of Keanu, invading that personal space without a second thought. He was so close that he could have touched Keanu's shoulder, but he didn't. He just stood there, blocking the light, casting a shadow over the workbench. Keanu didn't look up immediately. He finished tightening a bolt, wiped his hands on a rag, and then slowly turned his head. He had a neutral expression on his face, ready to help a customer, expecting a normal question about horsepower or price, but there was no question. The man didn't say, "Excuse me," or "Can you help me?" Instead, he pointed a finger right at Keanu's chest. He pointed it aggressively, like a weapon. "You," the man barked, his voice loud and sharp. "Stop fiddling with that and listen to me." A silence fell over the immediate area. It was the kind of silence that hurts your ears. The mechanics nearby froze, holding their breath. They looked at Keanu, then at the stranger, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was the moment the trap was sprung. The man continued, his tone dripping with arrogance. I want to look at the bike behind this one. The red one in the corner. But this piece of junk is blocking my view. He waved a hand dismissively at the custom prototype Keanu had been inspecting, a bike that represented hundreds of hours of work. Move it now, push it out of the way so I can see the other one. And be careful, don't scratch it. He actually snapped his fingers. It was a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Snap, snap. Hurry up, he added. I haven't got all day. The audacity of the request was shocking. He was asking the co-founder of the company to manually shove a 500-pound motorcycle across the floor just so he could look at a different one. But the truly shocking part was the way he said it. He spoke to Keanu as if he were nothing, as if he were a servant who existed solely to do his bidding. Suddenly, a sales associate from the front of the shop rushed over. He had seen the customer walking toward the back and had sprinted to intercept him, but he was too late. He skidded to a stop beside them, his face pale with panic. Sir! The sales associate gasped, putting a hand up to stop the customer. Sir, please! You can't. Shut up. The customer shouted, whipping his head around to glare at the salesperson. I am talking to this employee. You don't tell me what I can't do. He turned his back on the sales associate, dismissing him completely, and locked eyes with Keanu again. Well, what are you waiting for? He sneered. I told you to move it. Are you deaf? Or just lazy? I'm a paying customer, and I'm giving you an order. The sales associate looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He looked at Keanu, his eyes pleading, terrified that his boss was about to get screamed at by this lunatic. The mechanics nearby were tense, their hands clenching into fists. They had never seen anyone treat Keanu with such disrespect. The contrast was painful to watch. Here was one of the kindest, most humble men in the world, being spoken to like dirt by a stranger who thought his money bought him the right to be cruel. Keanu still hadn't said a word. He was just standing there, holding the rag, looking at the man. There was no anger on his face yet, just a look of pure confusion. He was trying to process what was happening. He looked at the finger pointing at him, then at the man's angry face, then back at the sales associate who was practically shaking with fear. The gears were turning in his head. He was trying to figure out if this was a prank or a joke or if this man was actually serious. The customer, frustrated by the lack of movement, took a step closer. He got right into Keanu's face. Listen to me, he hissed, lowering his voice but making it even more threatening. If you don't move this bike right now, I'm going to have you fired. Do you understand me? I'll buy this whole place just to fire you. He thought he had all the power. He thought he held all the cards. He had no idea that the man he was threatening to fire was the one who owned the whole building. The tension in the room was at a breaking point. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for Keanu to yell back or to call security or to tell the guy to get out. But Keanu didn't do any of that. He just stood there, frozen in time, staring at the stranger who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The customer's chest was puffed out, his ego inflated, thinking he had won. But the ground beneath him was about to crack. He had pushed the wrong button, and he was the only one in the room who didn't know it yet. The customer's last angry word was still hanging in the air when Keanu finally moved. He didn't jump, and he didn't rush. He didn't shout back. In fact, his movement was incredibly slow, almost like he was moving through water. He turned around, away from the workbench, to face the man who had been screaming at him. As he turned, the harsh overhead lights caught his face, illuminating the features that billions of people around the world recognized instantly. The customer, whose chest was still puffed out with pride, expecting the mechanic to cower in fear, suddenly stopped. His mouth was slightly open, ready to deliver another insult, but the words got stuck in his throat. His brain was trying to process what his eyes were seeing. He looked at the man standing in front of him. He saw the scruffy beard, the messy hair, the sad eyes, and the gentle, tired expression. Then it clicked. It was like watching a balloon suddenly deflate. The color instantly drained from the customer's face, turning it a pale shade of white. His eyes went wide, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't believe the image in front of him was real. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. This wasn't just a mechanic he had been bullying. This wasn't some random employee he could push around. This was Keanu Reeves. This was the guy from The Matrix. This was the guy from John Wick. This was one of the most famous and most beloved actors on the planet, and he had just threatened to fire him. The silence that fell over the shop was absolute. It was heavier than before. It was a suffocating, electric silence that felt like it might crack the windows. Everyone in the room, the mechanics, the sales associates, the people browsing in the corner all stopped what they were doing to watch. They knew what had just happened. They knew that the bully had finally realized who he was messing with, but the most powerful reaction didn't come from the customer. It came from Keanu. Keanu didn't say a single word. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell, "Do you know who I am?" He didn't call for security to throw the man out. Instead, he just froze. He stood perfectly still, staring at the customer with an expression that was almost impossible to read. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of deep confusion and mild curiosity. His eyebrows furrowed slightly and his head tilted just a fraction to the left. Like a dog trying to understand a strange noise, he looked the man up and down, taking in the expensive suit, the polished shoes, and the red, sweaty face. Then he looked back at the man's eyes. He didn't blink. It was a long, uncomfortable stare. He was letting the silence do the talking. It was the kind of silence that forces you to hear your own heartbeat, the kind of silence that makes you realize how foolish you sound. The customer started to sweat. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the shop burning into his back. He could feel the judgment hanging in the air. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, or maybe to make an excuse, but nothing came out. He just stammered, I didn't. His voice was weak now, trembling. All the power and authority had drained out of him. He looked like a child who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except the stakes were much higher. He had made a complete fool of himself in front of a Hollywood icon. Keanu still didn't move. He stood there, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, completely relaxed. He looked like a statue carved out of stone. The contrast between the two men was striking. The customer was vibrating with anxiety, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, wiping sweat from his forehead. Keanu was the picture of calm. He was the eye of the storm. He was standing in his own shop, being treated with disrespect, and yet he was the one in control. The seconds ticked by. It felt like minutes. It felt like hours. The air conditioner hummed in the background, creating a soft, buzzing noise that only made the silence feel louder. A drop of sweat rolled down the customer's temple. He looked at the sales associate standing nearby, silently begging for help, but the associate just looked back at him with a blank expression. No one was going to save him. He was on his own. Keanu's face was impossible to read, but if you looked closely you could see a tiny hint of disappointment. It wasn't a look of hatred. It was worse. It was a look that said, "I thought we were better than this." It was a look that questioned why a human being would treat another human being that way, regardless of who they were. That quiet disappointment was more powerful than any shout could ever be. It cut through the customer's ego like a hot knife through butter. The customer started to shrink. He literally seemed to get smaller as his posture collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward and he lowered his head. He couldn't hold Keanu's gaze. It was too much. The weight of his own behavior was finally crashing down on him. He realized he had been cruel, he had been loud, and he had been wrong. And now he had to face the consequences without a single word being spoken against him. Keanu took a very deep breath. He let it out slowly, his chest rising and falling. He was giving the man a moment to collect himself, a moment to think about what he had done. It was a mercy. It was a chance to retreat. But the customer was frozen too, trapped by his own embarrassment. In that frozen moment, the entire shop learned a lesson. They saw that you don't need to be loud to be strong. You don't need to scream to win an argument. Sometimes all you need to do is stand your ground and look at someone with truth in your eyes. Keanu Reeves, the action hero, didn't need to throw a punch to knock this man down. He just needed to be himself. He just needed to stand there, quiet and still, and let the man's own actions destroy him. The freeze was the ultimate retribution. It was a mirror held up to the customer's soul, showing him exactly how ugly he looked when he was acting like a king in a world of equals. The silence in the showroom was so heavy that it felt like the air pressure had dropped. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The customer was trembling, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate for a way to escape, but unable to move his legs. Keanu, however, remained perfectly still. He just stood there, his hands resting calmly at his sides, his expression soft but unyielding. It was a standoff, but it wasn't between two fighters. It was between ego and reality. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Keanu's face changed. It didn't harden into anger. It didn't twist into a sneer. Instead, the corners of his mouth twitched upward, not into a mocking grin, but into a small, sad, almost pitying smile. It was the kind of smile you give a child who doesn't understand why they can't touch a hot stove. It was a smile that said, "I see you, and I feel sorry for you." He slowly exhaled a long, steady breath that seemed to break the tension holding the room hostage. He didn't look at the sales associates for help. He didn't look at the mechanics for backup. He kept his eyes locked on the customer in the suit. Then, in a voice that was incredibly soft and gentle, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "You know," Keanu said quietly, his tone calm and conversational, "I think you're looking at this whole situation the wrong way." The customer blinked, stunned that Keanu was actually speaking to him. He opened his mouth to apologize, to start stammering out excuses about who he was and how much money he had, but Keanu held up a single hand. It was a stop gesture, but it wasn't aggressive. It was just a signal to wait. Keanu continued, his voice still carrying that incredibly smooth, natural rhythm. "You asked me to move this bike, and that's fair. You want to see something else, and you think this is in your way." He paused, glancing down at the beautiful machine beside him, running a hand affectionately over the warm metal. "But the thing is, I'm not moving it. Not because I'm lazy, and not because I don't want to help you. I'm not moving it because I'm buying it." The customer's jaw nearly hit the floor. He blinked rapidly, completely confused. You're what?" he stammered. "I'm buying it," Keanu repeated with a shrug, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I own the place, sure, but I'm also a customer today. And I really like this one. So I'm going to stand here and look at it a bit longer." He turned his attention back to the bike, admiring the lines of the frame. Completely dismissing the customer's urgency, the man in the suit stood there, deflated. He had built his whole argument on the idea that Keanu was a servant, someone beneath him. Now that reality had crashed in, his entire strategy had fallen apart. But Keanu wasn't done. He turned back to face the man, and his expression became a little more serious, though his eyes remained kind. "And there's something else?" Keanu added, his voice dropping an octave, becoming more intimate and direct. He stepped just a tiny bit closer. The customer instinctively stepped back, intimidated not by anger, but by the sheer presence of the man. "The way you spoke to my friend earlier," Keanu said, nodding his head slightly toward the young mechanic who was standing frozen in the background. "The way you're treating the staff? That's not okay. These people aren't servants. They are artists. They build masterpieces with their hands. They deserve your respect, not your anger." He didn't say it with malice. He didn't shout it. He said it with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact, like the sky is blue or water is wet. He wasn't attacking the customer. He was simply correcting him. It was a lesson in humility. Delivered without raising a voice, the customer looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He mumbled something that sounded like, "I didn't know," or "I'm sorry," but it was so quiet that nobody really heard it. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Just minutes ago, this man was a king in his own mind. Now he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. Keanu didn't wait for a full apology. He didn't need one. He had made his point. He gave the customer a small, polite nod, the kind of nod you give a stranger on the sidewalk. "Have a good day," Keanu said softly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then he turned his back on the man. It was a dismissal, but a graceful one. He turned back to the head mechanic and picked up the conversation exactly where they had left off, as if the interruption had never happened. "So, about that suspension," he said, pointing at the bike. The atmosphere in the shop instantly changed. The tightness in everyone's chests vanished. The air felt lighter. The staff members looked at each other with wide eyes, huge smiles breaking out on their faces. They felt seen. They felt protected. It was a rare moment where the big boss actually stood in the trenches with them. The customer in the suit stood there for a moment longer, looking lost. He looked at the bike, at the staff, and at the back of Keanu Reeves, who was already deep in conversation about torque and horsepower. The man realized there was nothing left for him here. He had already lost, and he hadn't even realized the game had started. He turned toward the exit, walking much slower than when he came in. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the sales associate at the desk. He didn't snap his fingers. He didn't complain about the temperature. He just walked to the glass doors, his expensive shoes clicking quietly now, almost sounding apologetic. When the doors slid open, he stepped out into the bright sunlight, escaping the cool, calm judgment of the showroom. Inside, the shop returned to its normal rhythm. The sound of tools clinking returned. The smell of coffee felt comforting again. The young mechanic wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek, looking over at Keanu with a look of hero worship that had nothing to do with movies. Keanu caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up and a warm grin. The grin wasn't for a camera. It wasn't for the press. It was just for them. It turned out that the biggest action star in the world didn't need to fight anyone to protect his team. He didn't need to throw a punch or fire a gun. All he needed was a quiet voice, a calm demeanor, and the courage to stand up for what was right. As the afternoon sun moved across the floor, casting long shadows again, the dealership felt more like a family than ever before. They had seen the true character of the man who owned the place, and he was exactly the hero they hoped he would be.